Let me tell you something. I have sat on a bench for decades. I have looked into the eyes of liars, cheats, fraudsters, deadbeats, and criminals of every variety. I have seen things in that courtroom that would make your hair stand on end. But every once in a while, a case comes across that stops even me cold. Not because of the violence, not because of the planning, but because of the face sitting across from justice, young, calm, smirking. She was 14 years old, 14, and she sat in that courtroom with her legs swinging under the defense table like she was waiting for the school bus. The prosecutor was describing the deaths of her parents, and this girl had a smirk on her face. Not confusion, not grief, not even the fake performance of remorse that most defendants at least bother to put on for the jury. A smirk, like she found the whole thing mildly amusing. I have seen a lot of defendants in my time. I know the difference between someone who is scared and hiding it, someone who is guilty and performing innocence, and someone who simply does not care. This girl did not care. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the most dangerous kind of person I have ever encountered in a courtroom. Let me take you back to the beginning because this story does not start in a courtroom. It starts in a perfectly ordinary suburban home on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, in a neighborhood where people waved to each other from their porches and children played on front lawns. The kind of neighborhood where you would never in a million years expect what was about to happen. The father's name was Michael. He was the kind of man who set his alarm for 5 in the morning, not because anyone made him, but because he believed in getting ahead of the day. He showered in the dark so he would not wake his wife. He brewed the coffee. He worked as an accountant downtown, precise and reliable. He checked his children's homework. He color-coded the family calendar. He believed that structure was love, that clear rules and consistent expectations were how you showed a child you cared about their future. Was he a pushover? Absolutely not. Was he a monster? Not by any stretch of the imagination. The mother's name was Sarah. She volunteered 2 afternoons a week at the local elementary school, reading to first graders, helping them sound out difficult words. On the mornings, she was not volunteering. She put handwritten notes in her children's lunch boxes, not just any notes, specifically composed messages that acknowledged something each child had done well the previous day or encouraged them about something coming up. She kept a family calendar. She baked cookies on rainy days. She organized movie nights when the weather turned cold. Sunday dinners were sacred in that house. Birthday traditions were never skipped. To anyone looking in from the outside, and plenty of people did look in, Michael and Sarah Thompson had built something most people spend their entire lives searching for: a genuinely safe home, a real family, 2 people who loved their children and worked every single day to show it. Now, their younger son was 11 years old at the time these events unfolded. Quiet kid, sensitive. He had inherited his father's attention to detail and his mother's emotional awareness. He noticed things other kids did not bother to notice. He made his father tea when he came home tired. He heard his mother crying softly at the kitchen sink and felt it as his own pain. He was not the kid who dominated a room. He was the kid who watched the room carefully and understood it better than anyone else in it. And what happened to that child as a result of his sister's actions is something I will come back to because it is one of the most devastating parts of this entire story. Then there was the daughter. And here is where I need you to pay close attention because this is not a story about a confused teenager who made a terrible, impulsive mistake. I want to be very clear about that right from the start. This is a story about a young person who felt that her parents' rules and expectations were unacceptable constraints on her freedom and who made a cold, calculated, methodical decision to eliminate those constraints permanently, not by running away, not by acting out, not by the typical rebellions of adolescence, by poisoning them. From early childhood, she had demanded to be the center of everything. As she moved into her teenage years, that need transformed into resentment. The rules her parents imposed felt like oppression. The structure they maintained felt like control. When she was denied something, she did not process it as a boundary. She processed it as a personal attack. She kept a journal hidden under her mattress filled with extensive writing about how unfair her life was, how her parents did not understand her, how she would be happier without them. The tension between her and her parents had been building for years, so gradually that no single moment could be identified as the breaking point. It was the slow accumulation of small conflicts, curfews challenged, phone usage monitored, attitudes punished, freedoms restricted. And here is where I will tell you something I have learned from a lifetime in courtrooms. There is a version of that story that sounds sympathetic. Teenager resents strict parents. Teenager feels misunderstood. Teenager acts out. That is a story as old as time, and most of the time it ends with the teenager growing up and realizing their parents were trying to protect them, but that is not what happened here. What happened here was that a young person made a deliberate choice to research, acquire, plan, and execute the murders of the two people who had raised her, and then sat in a courtroom and smirked about it. Let me tell you about the morning everything changed. She was already awake before anyone else in the house. It was early, still dark outside, the house quiet. While her parents slept and her younger brother slept, she moved through the kitchen with what investigators would later describe as surgical precision. She was wearing latex gloves, she had a small container, and she added a white powder to the orange juice pitcher that her mother had freshly squeezed the night before and stored in the refrigerator. By the time Sarah came downstairs to make breakfast, toast, scrambled eggs, that orange juice, the poison was already waiting. When her parents came to the table, she sat down with them. She smiled, she made conversation, she asked about their day, and she watched them eat. She herself had a glass of water, just water. She had already decided she would not be eating that morning. By 7:15, her father was touching his tongue to the roof of his mouth with a look of confusion. "Does this taste odd to you?" he asked Sarah. She paused, nodded. There was a metallic quality to the juice, a faint chemical undertone to the toast. Their daughter suggested maybe the orange juice had gone bad. Maybe they had used old eggs. She offered reasonable explanations while knowing exactly what they had consumed. By 8:30, Michael was nauseous. By 9 o'clock, both parents were sick. Their daughter emerged from her room periodically to ask if they needed anything. She brought them water. She made sympathetic sounds about food poisoning. She suggested they rest. She performed the role of a concerned teenager with what witnesses would later describe as disturbing precision. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she called 911, steady voice, clear address, exactly the right amount of worry in her tone. Not too much, not too little, just enough. The ambulance came. The neighbors watched from their porches. Two parents were loaded onto stretchers while their daughter stood in the driveway with her younger brother, watching. During the drive to their grandmother's house, she asked worried questions. She displayed every behavior a frightened child would display. She was performing a role, and she was performing it flawlessly. Michael died first. His organs failed one system at a time. Sarah followed by mourning. And in that hospital, while machines beeped and monitors flickered and an 11-year-old boy learned that both his parents were gone, their daughter sat in the waiting room and waited to be brought in for questioning. Now let me tell you what the medical examiner found. Dr. Patricia Hernandez had worked in that office for 23 years. She had performed thousands of autopsies. She had seen death in every form imaginable. But when Michael and Sarah Thompson arrived on her table, something shifted. These bodies showed no signs of violence, no wounds, no defensive injuries, just the quiet, systematic failure of every organ system, one after another, as a substance that had no business being inside a human body moved through them and destroyed everything in its path. The toxicology results came back with devastating clarity. Both victims had consumed a poison powerful enough to be lethal in relatively small doses, yet slow-acting enough to initially appear as a mild illness. The concentrations found in their blood could only have resulted from deliberate administration. This was not accidental contamination. This was not spoiled food. This was murder, intentional, calculated, carried out by someone who had known exactly what they were doing. The police investigation shifted immediately. Detectives were assigned. The house was sealed as a crime scene. Every surface was photographed. Every item in the kitchen was cataloged and tested. The orange juice pitcher was analyzed. The plates were swabbed. The kitchen garbage was sifted through piece by piece. What they found was methodical evidence of planning. No forced entry. No signs of robbery, no struggle. The doors had been locked from the inside. The windows were secure. Nothing had been disturbed except for the lives of two people who had been poisoned in the place they felt safest. The killer had not needed to break in. The killer was already inside. The killer had access to everything. The killer had been there all along. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and never miss a story like this one. The younger brother was interviewed first. He was still in shock. He was barely able to process the questions being asked of him, but when detectives asked what he remembered about that morning, something shifted in his expression. He hesitated. He looked down at his hands. He asked if he would get in trouble for telling the truth. The detective assured him that telling the truth was the most important thing he could do, and the boy took a breath and began to describe what he had seen. His sister in the kitchen before their parents came down, his sister moving around the food, his sister watching them eat with an expression he could not quite explain. It was the first crack in what would become the complete collapse of her carefully constructed story. Meanwhile, in a separate room with her lawyer present, the girl maintained perfect composure. She expressed shock about her parents' deaths. She said she did not understand why anyone would think she was involved. She suggested that maybe someone had broken in while the family slept. Maybe someone had poisoned the food from outside the house. Every accusation was met with a calm, reasonable alternative explanation. She was 14 years old and already composed enough to lie directly to police investigators without showing a single tell. But the evidence was building around her whether she acknowledged it or not. Detectives contacted the high school chemistry department and requested records of all chemical compounds accessed by students in the months before the poisoning. The records were meticulous: names, dates, substances, purposes, and there it was, clear and undeniable. 6 weeks before her parents fell ill, the girl had checked out a compound from the school chemistry lab. The authorization form bore her name. The substance she had checked out was the exact poison found in her parents' blood work. When the chemistry teacher was questioned, she admitted she barely remembered the interaction. The girl had seemed focused, serious about her education. She had asked the right questions. She had seemed trustworthy. And so the teacher had signed off without consulting the safety manual that would have told her this substance had absolutely no place in a high school student's hands. Teachers began coming forward with observations they had dismissed at the time. The chemistry teacher remembered detailed questions about how substances metabolized in the human body, questions far more sophisticated than typical teenage curiosity. The biology teacher recalled a term paper on organ failure and toxicology. The English teacher mentioned a creative writing assignment in which a character poisoned someone and escaped justice because everyone assumed it was an accident, individually unremarkable, collectively a portrait of someone who had been studying the mechanics of what she planned to do. Her computer confirmed everything. The search history was extensive and systematic. Weeks of research on poisons, their properties, their effects, their lethality, forums on toxicology, educational videos about how the human body processes different substances, dosage calculators, and then, in the week before the poisoning, the searches shifted. Inheritance law, what happens to a minor's parents' estate when both parents die, guardianship laws, her parents' financial documents, their net worth, savings accounts, investment portfolios. She was not just planning to escape their rules, she was planning to fund a new life with their money. She had thought of everything, or so she believed, because what she had not thought of was her little brother. The second interview with the boy was different from the first. This one required him to look directly at the truth of what his sister had done. He was escorted into a small room with a detective and a child psychologist. The interview was recorded. He was offered water, which he drank in small, nervous sips. He described waking early that morning, unable to sleep, going downstairs for water, finding his sister already in the kitchen, wearing latex gloves, holding a small container, carefully pouring a white powder into the orange juice pitcher. He described the moment she realized he was there, the way her expression changed, not angry, not startled, cold, calculating. She had set down what she was doing and walked toward him slowly. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and in a voice that was remarkably composed for a 14-year-old, she explained exactly what would happen if he told anyone what he had just witnessed. She told him she had put something in the juice to make their parents sick. Not to kill them, she said, just to make them pay attention, to make them realize how unhappy she was, to make them change the rules. But if he told anyone at all, the police would arrest both of them. Social services would separate them. He would grow up without a family. Was he really willing to destroy everything just because he could not keep his mouth shut? He believed her. He was 11 years old and he believed every word of it. He went to school that morning carrying the weight of what he knew. He sat through arithmetic and history while his brain screamed at him. When he was pulled from class and told both parents were in the hospital, He wanted desperately to tell someone, but he heard her voice in his head, cold and certain, and he stayed silent. By the time he arrived at the hospital and learned that both of them were dying, the guilt had become a physical thing inside his chest. He watched his sister in the waiting room performing grief and realized the truth. She had known exactly what would happen. The story about just wanting to make them sick was another manipulation, another way of controlling him, another layer of the plan. The detective asked him why he was finally telling the truth after days of silence. His answer was simple, devastating. Because my parents are dead, he said, and I let it happen because I did not tell. I am the reason they are dead. I could have stopped it, but I did not, and now I have to live with that forever. Let me be very direct about something right here. That child did not let it happen. She made certain he could not stop it. She looked her 11-year-old brother in the eyes and used his love for his family as a weapon against him. She turned him into an unwilling accomplice through fear and manipulation, and the guilt he carried as a result of that is one of the most unconscionable parts of this entire case. Subscribe now, because this kind of story deserves an audience that understands what accountability really means. The day after the recorded statement, she was arrested, pulled from her classroom in the middle of the school day in handcuffs while her classmates watched. The news cameras caught it. For the first time, the trademark smirk was gone, replaced by a flash of what might have been surprise or anger or the sudden realization that her carefully constructed plan had finally and completely failed. When her public defender met with her and explained the charges, described the evidence, and told her about her brother's testimony, she showed no reaction. She did not ask about the severity of the charges. She did not ask about potential sentences. She did not ask about the evidence or the witnesses or what came next. She asked when she could make a phone call, and when she was told she could not because she was in custody, she nodded and sat back in her chair with the patience of someone waiting for an inconvenience to pass. The public defender made extensive notes, not about a frightened teenager facing serious consequences, about someone whose emotional response to her circumstances appeared to be completely disconnected from reality. Now the courtroom. The juvenile courtroom was packed in a way that juvenile proceedings almost never are. Media had descended on the case. The public gallery was filled with journalists, sketch artists, and ordinary citizens who had taken time off work to witness what they understood was a historic and disturbing proceeding. Her father's brother sat directly behind the prosecution table, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed it might crack. Her maternal grandmother sat on the other side with a look of confusion and betrayal that never quite left her face throughout the trial. The girl was brought in escorted by 2 juvenile detention officers, plain clothes, no jewelry, and yet she moved through that courtroom with the casual confidence of someone who had not yet grasped, or simply did not care, what was happening to her. She took her seat at the defense table, and immediately her eyes began scanning the room, cataloging people, assessing the gallery like an audience. When her eyes landed on her uncle, when she saw the raw grief carved into his face, she smiled, small, private, as if his pain was mildly interesting to her. Judge Margaret Chen, who presided over this case, warned the girl twice in the first day alone about rolling her eyes, shaking her head at evidence, and generally treating the proceedings as if they were beneath her. The girl nodded both times with the air of someone acknowledging instructions she had no intention of following. When photographs of her deceased parents were displayed, images of Michael and Sarah in their hospital beds, she glanced away, not out of distress, out of what looked like boredom. When the prosecutor described her father's final moments as his organs failed one by one, she stared at the ceiling. The jury noticed. Everyone noticed. The evidence presentation on the second day was methodical and comprehensive. The pathologist described in clinical detail exactly what the poison had done to both victims: the organ failure, the timeline, the suffering. The forensic toxicologist explained that the dosages found in the blood work indicated someone who had understood precisely what they were administering. The amounts were too precise to be guesswork. The timing was too calculated to be coincidence. Then came the security footage from the school chemistry lab. Displayed on the courtroom screens, it showed her in that hallway. It showed the exact date and time. It showed her signing the checkout form. It showed her handling the container. She watched herself on the screen, and for the first time in the entire trial, her composure fractured. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on the defense table, began to shake. Her eyes filled with tears, not tears of remorse, tears of fury. She was watching herself being caught acquiring the murder weapon, and she was furious at being so thoroughly documented. Her search history was projected onto the courtroom screens next. The jury could read her queries directly. Lethal doses. How fast does this compound work? Signs of poisoning. How to make someone sick without it looking intentional. Each search term was another brick in the wall. Each query was another piece of her planning laid bare for 12 strangers to examine. By the time the prosecution rested, the girl's earlier composure had been almost entirely stripped away. The smirks were gone. She sat at the defense table with her arms wrapped around herself, an expression of barely contained rage replacing everything else. She had been caught. The evidence was so thorough, so clear, so utterly undeniable that there was no pretending it away. On the third day, the prosecution called its most crucial witness. The boy was brought in through a side entrance to spare him from walking through the packed gallery. He was 11 years old, small for his age, visibly terrified. His grandmother had dressed him carefully, not so formal as to seem staged, but neat enough to show respect. A bailiff helped him climb into the witness chair, which had been specially lowered for juvenile witnesses. He gripped the edges of that chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor approached him gently. Simple questions first. His name, his age, whether he understood the importance of telling the truth. His voice was barely audible to the people sitting in the back of the courtroom. Then she asked him to describe what he had seen on the morning his parents were poisoned. His eyes filled with tears immediately. His hands began to shake. He took the water the judge offered and drank it in small, unsteady sips. And then he spoke. And his small voice filled that silent courtroom with a truth more powerful than any piece of physical evidence that had been collected. He described waking early, going downstairs, finding his sister in the kitchen with gloves on, watching her pour the powder into the pitcher. The moment she saw him, the cold expression on her face, the slow walk toward him, the hand on his shoulder, the threat delivered in a calm, controlled voice that a 14-year-old had no business being able to produce. Some jurors were crying. Some were leaning forward as if they could somehow protect this child from the memory he was being asked to relive. When the prosecutor asked him to repeat the specific words his sister had used when she threatened him, he looked toward his grandmother in the gallery. She nodded. He turned back, and in a voice so quiet it seemed to come from a great distance, he recounted every word of the threat she had made. Across the courtroom, the girl's face grew darker with every sentence. Her hands clenched into fists. At one point, she actually lunged forward, and her attorney physically pulled her back, whispering urgently in her ear. The judge's response was immediate. "I am going to warn you one time. If there is any further outburst from the defendant, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on her brother with an expression of such concentrated rage that several jurors visibly recoiled. The boy, who had already found the courage to come this far, looked even more frightened, but he kept going. He described the guilt of that school day, the moment he was pulled from class and told his parents were in the hospital, the desperate urge to tell someone, held back by her voice in his head, arriving at the hospital, learning they were dying, watching his sister perform grief in the waiting room, and understanding finally that she had known this was going to happen all along. The prosecutor asked him one simple question. "Did you want to tell someone what you saw that morning?" "Yes," he whispered, "but I was scared. She said we would both go to jail. I did not want to go to jail, so I did not tell. And now they are dead, and I could have stopped it, but I did not. And now it is my fault too." Judge Chen intervened directly at that moment. "It is not your fault," she said, with a firmness that needed to be heard. "You were manipulated by someone you trusted. You were threatened. You were frightened. What happened to your parents is not your responsibility. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, but the guilt written across his face told a different story. The story of a child who would spend years in therapy working toward the understanding that his mind accepted in that moment, but his heart was not yet ready to believe. The defense's closing argument rested heavily on the science of adolescent brain development. Their expert testified that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until the mid-20s, that impulse control in teenagers is inherently limited, that the girl's actions should be understood through the lens of a developing brain operating under psychological pressure. The prosecutor dismantled this argument with surgical efficiency. Brain development explains impulsive behavior, she pointed out. It does not explain weeks of methodical research. It does not explain precisely calculated dosages. It does not explain the deliberate acquisition of a specific chemical compound. It does not explain the carefully crafted threat delivered to an 11-year-old child to ensure his silence. It does not explain researching inheritance law. None of that is impulsive. All of it is premeditated. The brain development argument applies to teenagers who act without thinking. This teenager thought about nothing else for months. The forensic psychologist who testified for the prosecution was equally direct. He had evaluated hundreds of juveniles who had committed serious crimes. Most of them showed some indication, however small, that they understood what they had done was wrong. Most of them performed remorse even when they did not genuinely feel it, because they understood remorse was expected. This girl did none of those things. When confronted with evidence, she did not break down. She offered alternative explanations. Her composure was not the composure of someone suppressing emotion. It was the composure of someone who simply was not experiencing the emotions that everyone around her expected. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They asked for clarification on specific evidence. They requested transcripts of certain testimony. They were thorough. They were careful. At 4:47 in the afternoon, they returned. Guilty on the first count of first-degree murder, guilty on the second count of first-degree murder, unanimous, all 12 jurors, no hesitation. When the verdict was read, the girl's body went rigid. The composure she had maintained through weeks of proceedings simply ceased to exist. Her hands fell to her lap. Her eyes lost focus. For a moment, she appeared not to be breathing. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, and she seemed not to feel it. Her father's brother stood in the gallery and began to cry. Not from sadness alone, but from the specific relief of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer force of will and has finally been given permission to let go. The younger brother sat motionless next to his grandmother, her arm tight around him. He did not cry. He had been brave enough to tell the truth. His testimony had mattered. The system had worked. He would carry scars from this for the rest of his life, but he had done what needed to be done, and he had done it despite everything she had used to try to stop him. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Margaret Chen delivered remarks that deserve to be heard clearly. The defendant is 14 years old. That is a fact this court does not ignore. Adolescence is a time of development, a time when judgment is still forming. However, these facts do not change the nature of what the defendant did. This was not an impulsive act. This was not a teenage mistake born from poor judgment. This was a calculated, premeditated act of murder. The defendant spent weeks researching how to poison someone. She acquired the means to carry out that plan. She administered that poison to her parents while fully understanding what she was doing and what the consequences would be. And then the judge continued. Michael and Sarah Thompson created a safe home. They set rules because they loved their daughter and wanted to protect her. They did not deserve to be poisoned by the person they had raised. They did not deserve to have their trust weaponized against them. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, the girl finally said she was sorry, that she had not meant for them to die, that she just wanted them to listen. Judge Chen's response was cold and clear. Your remorse comes after they are dead. It comes after your brother has been devastated. It comes after a jury has convicted you. This court questions whether your remorse is genuine or whether it is simply the natural reaction of someone who finally understands that there will be consequences. 15 years, minimum 12 before any parole review, no guarantees of early release. When the sentence was delivered, she cried for the first time, real tears. Her attorney held her arm as she was led from the courtroom. She would not see the outside world freely again for a very long time. The house sold 6 months later to a family from out of state with no connection to what had happened inside it. They painted the walls. They replaced the kitchen cabinets. They made it into something else. Time, as it tends to do, moved forward. The younger brother went to live with his grandmother in a new neighborhood. Therapy began immediately, twice a week, with a child psychologist who helped him slowly and painstakingly separate guilt from responsibility. It would take years. The scars would remain. But he finished high school. He made friends. He built routines. He and his grandmother had Sunday dinners where they cooked together, learning recipes his mother had once tried to teach him. He allowed himself to laugh again. He allowed himself to live. On the 5th anniversary of his parents' deaths, he visited their graves for the first time since the funeral. He was 16. Tall and serious, carrying flowers he had chosen himself. He stood between the two headstones and let himself cry, not the traumatized tears of a child, but the more complicated grief of a teenager who understood that the people buried in front of him would never see what he was becoming. His grandmother stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder. "They would have been so proud of you," she said. He could not speak. He placed the flowers and stood in silence. Back in a juvenile detention facility, the girl marked the same anniversary the way she marked every day, with indifference. She attended required therapy sessions and contributed minimally. She participated in educational programs and completed her high school diploma. She made no genuine friendships. She showed no signs of remorse or growth or understanding of the harm she had caused. She moved through her days as if she was simply waiting for time to pass. Here is what I know. Justice is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. It does not always arrive in the way we imagine it will, but it arrives. And when it does, it often arrives because of one person who chose truth over fear, who decided that the right thing mattered more than the safe thing. In this case, that person was an 11-year-old boy sitting in a witness chair with his knuckles white on the armrests, his voice barely above a whisper, telling the truth about the worst morning of his life. She had threatened him. She had manipulated him. She had used his love for his family as a weapon against him. She had been absolutely certain that a child that young, that frightened, with that much to lose, would stay silent forever. She was wrong. Truth has a voice, and this time, that voice belonged to a child who decided that his parents deserved better than silence. Subscribe now and share this if you believe the truth always finds a way, no matter how hard someone works to bury it.